Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual event. My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I'm really excited for the conversation today with Tai Ming Cheung, who's a professor at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy and the director of the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. And today we're talking about his excellent new book, Innovate to Dominate: The Rise of the Chinese Techno-Security State, which was recently published by Cornell University Press. And I would say for folks who are trying to understand this fast-moving and expanding conversation of U.S.-China economic security and technological competition, how China conceptualizes the nexus of technology and security, economics and security, how China looks at industrial policy, but also if you're interested in understanding how the Chinese political economy works, how do Chinese enterprises nest in with the Chinese military, how does the leadership conceptualize and build the institutions and architecture of decision-making on security, how does China understand national security? All of that, Tai's book, I think, is an essential skeleton key for understanding this and the single best, I think, description of how China thinks about technology and national security. And it couldn't have come out at a better time, given that at the recent 20th Party Congress, which we'll discuss later in the conversation, we saw that there was a real consolidation of Beijing's view and assessment of the external environment it faces, of the necessity and need for China to continue to on this path of building what Tai calls a techno-security state. So it's the book to read to understand all of this. So the logistics of this are for the next 57 minutes and 32 seconds, I'm going to ask Tai some questions about the book that are designed to help us understand the basic parameters and main arguments of the book. We also invite folks to ask questions. So at any time, if you go onto the CSIS.org website, go to the events page and click the link for this event, you can send questions and those will be drip fed to me throughout the discussion. And I will try my best to incorporate those into the discussion as we go on. So we believe in participatory democracy here at CSIS and hope everyone can join the conversation. So with that, Tai, really appreciate you taking time to join. This is a rich book, and we're not going to get into 97% of it, but hope we can at least touch on some of the main arguments of this. And I thought perhaps I could move chronologically to some extent by starting where your book starts, which is Xi Jinping comes to power in late 2012. He is now at the helm of a country which, by any standard then, was a juggernaut. Economically, militarily, had grown significantly its capabilities over the last decade. But as you write, was also a country facing mounting headwinds that threatened to blow its rise off course. I wonder a moment if you can just give us a depiction of the world that you think Xi Jinping was looking out at. What was the external environment? Domestically, what were some of these headwinds that you think Xi Jinping saw? And I think especially a focus on the kind of military security space. What were the gaps and challenges you think that Xi Jinping assessed when he first took office?
Okay, thanks, Drew. That's great to have this discussion with you. Of course, you ask an easy question to get us going. So let's put ourselves back, sort of in 2012, at the 18th Party Congress. Sort of Xi Jinping comes to power. I mean, the first thing is what is the international security environment that Xi Jinping faces itself, and it's like, and so when he comes to power, sort of like the assessments by his predecessor Hu Jintao, by the military, by sort of like the security apparatus, is that China is in a relatively sort of benign security environment. If you look at things like the defense white papers, at sort of like a lot of the official assessments, is that there are complicating factors in the international security system. Sort of like tensions with the US are rising, there are frictions with Japan, etc. But overall, China is still sort of like doing well. It's sort of like there are no sort of fundamental security concerns. And so because of this, sort of like everyone thinks that when Xi Jinping comes to power, it's like, well, he's going to follow the same course as his predecessors. It's like it's about sort of like peaceful development. Economic development still assumes the top priority, but very quickly, sort of like it is not at the 18th Party Congress, but shortly afterwards, it's like Xi Jinping begins to provide his perspectives, right? And this is a leader who had been number two, sort of like to Hu Jintao for the previous 5 years, and he hadn't said anything about his assessment. So when he talks about it, it's like he begins to say, well, the security environment is actually very, very worrisome itself. It's like we have to sort of like begin to sort of like sort of think in more sort of like sort of threatening terms, etc. And one of the reasons why he does this is that, and we see this sort of like in the course of the next couple of years, he redefines what national security is. It's like, I mean, under sort of the previous regimes, it's not just Hu Jintao, but Jiang Zemin and Deng Xiaoping before then. I mean, they saw sort of like their assessment of the international security environment was in very much sort of like a Western neo-realist terms about the balance of power, sort of like about sort of like sort of hard external threats, etc. And if you look at that, China doesn't really face that. But Xi Jinping, sort of like who for much of his career was a party apparatchik and remains so, he makes it clear that it's like well, when we look at national security, it's not about sort of like near realist perspectives. That's important. But the most important is about political and ideological issues. And of course, it's like and when he comes to power, some of the meetings that he has shortly after as the paramount leader, he talks about, well, we have to look at the downfall of the Soviet Union, sort of like as sort of like in very different terms than what we had. It's about sort of like national security and political security. It's about the security of the Communist Party. It's about sort of like ideological security. And when you look at that, like from that perspective, sort of national security for China is under serious concerns. It's like domestically as well as externally. So from all of this, it's like sort of Xi Jinping begins to sort of like use these foundations that like we're sort of like he says, we're going to pursue a very different course. It's like the development remains paramount, etc. But security becomes even more important, and security from a very, very different sort of like sort of formulation and framework.
Can I ask a counterfactual, which is if Li Keqiang had taken over as general secretary in 2012 and was looking out at this world you describe, do we imagine that he would have come to many of the same conclusions about gaps and shortcomings that needed to be addressed? Or is there something unique to how Xi Jinping experienced the years, 2011 Wenzhou train crash, the Edward Snowden leaks, the Arab Spring? You had this whole set of cataclysmic events which probably helped contribute to some of this acute fear or understanding of the shortcomings of China's national security state. Is this Xi Jinping's unique view of this, or do you think another Communist Party leader would have also come to many of the same conclusions? I realize this is an impossible question to answer, but humor me.
Right. I mean, it's like, so I mean, when I was writing this book, yeah, but it's like, I mean, a lot of people said, it's like, I mean, pose the same question. It's like, how much is there of continuity and how much there of change for Xi Jinping? And while I think, yes, there are sort of important threads that come through. It's like, I mean, it's like Xi Jinping is not completely new, sort of like when he comes to power, and there's a lot of sort of like as you've mentioned, some of these sort of worries and trends, in particular, sort of like the global financial crisis, sort of like in 2008, 2009, that leads China to reassess how it relates to the international system and the weakness of the West, etc. But it's like, but there are those sort of like trends and continuity from the previous administration. But to me, I think that there's much more change. That Xi Jinping, he comes to look at a lot of the issues that he takes charge of from a very different perspective. So in the overall balance, he's a very, very different leader, both because of how sort of like he brings sort of like Communist Party ideology in terms of how he thinks about sort of like development and security, the relationship between that, how he sees the role of military power, sort of like and how he sees sort of like China's place sort of like in the world, and the historical sort of like framing of that. I mean, and from that, he's very different from the technocrats and the bureaucrats and the political elites who have spent all their time in Beijing, like people like Li Keqiang and others in the Politburo itself. And it's like, and so when he gets put in, I mean, that's why it's a shock to the system, I think, for the people who chose him. And it's like, and he makes it pretty quickly that he's a very different leader with the anti-corruption campaigns, with all sort of like the remaking of the security system, and it's like, and his priorities on sort of like on a much more assertive foreign policy, etc. All that comes. It takes a little bit of time, but it's like when you see it today, it's like all of that is like put in place fairly quickly by Xi Jinping when he gets to power. So I think it's the change is much more significant than the continuity.
Just lingering on the transition from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping for a minute. A previous book you wrote called Fortifying China was an exploration of changes to China's defense industrial base and how it thought about military modernization, civil military relations. Can you give us a thumbnail description of how in 2011, 2012, how were policymakers in Beijing conceptualizing the relationship between the civil economy and the defense industrial base? You know, one of the arguments you make in Fortifying China is that there had been, I don't know if I'd call them market reforms, but certainly a marketization to some extent under Hu Jintao and in terms of the defense industrial base. But can you just give us a thumbnail sketch of how it looked and how policymakers thought about it in 2011, 2012?
I mean, it's at the turn of the decade itself. It's I mean, there was from that there was a lot of continuity, sort of like under Hu Jintao. It's like the importance of defense industrial development, modernization, sort of defense innovation. All that was like of a high priority, and there's these efforts to sort of like to provide sort of like a lot more sort of like resources, allow the state-owned sort of conglomerates involved in the defense space sort of like a lot more sort of autonomy and freedom, and placing sort of like the role of the People's Liberation Army to like at the forefront. So in that way, so like the military modernization, the defense industrial and development and defense innovation was going at a very rapid click. And what Xi Jinping does is like he builds upon that, and he sort of like he doesn't really sort of change course on that. He accelerates it and emphasizes more and more. I mean, one of the sort of big differences is in the area of military civil fusion. So sort of like the term sort of military civil fusion is sort of is a term that sort of that came during the second term of Hu Jintao's rule. It wasn't sort of Xi Jinping didn't make it, but sort of for Hu Jintao, sort of military civil fusion was what I would say it was a sort of a relatively sort of a mid-level policy initiative. It was sort of like in the nuts and bolts of the defense industrialization process. And Xi Jinping, when he takes charge, it takes him a little while. He doesn't immediately sort of focus on military civil fusion. It takes him sort of like until sort of the third year he's in power, 2015. And then he says military civil fusion, sort of like or what sort of we talk about is the sort of how you sort of like integrate the civilian and military parts of the economy. Well, it's like he says, well, under the previous leaderships, it's like it was. They paid lip service. It was there, but it wasn't elevated as a top priority. For me, military civil fusion is a core part of this sort of remaking and building of a sort of this techno-security state. So he moves it from a middle level sort of industrial policy initiative, and he says, especially in 2015, he says this is a top level national priority at the same level as innovation policy, at the same level as or like as sort of industrial policy made in China 2025, etc. And so for him, sort of like he sees a lot of these issues that are sort of like at the technocratic level of development under Hu Jintao, that it's sort of left to the bureaucrats and to sort of like to the mid-level managers. Xi Jinping says, well, I'm going to take personal charge of this, and I'm going to sort of like sort of focus this at a very, very senior level. And so that's sort of the difference sort of under Hu Jintao and then sort of like and even Jiang Zemin, etc. Military modernization, sort of defense innovation, etc. Those were important, but it's like, but they were not personally sort of like invested in this. It was part of their portfolio as the paramount leaders. Under Xi Jinping, he says these are the most important issues, and I'm gonna sort of be personally engaged in this, and like and also on other areas of military modernization, the revamping of how the PLA is run and all of that. It's like he makes this sort of like one of his core missions, etc. So that's a very, very different sort of important difference. That Xi Jinping, he doesn't sort of deal with these issues because that's part of his portfolio. He says this is critical, and I'm going to invest as much time and energy as is necessary to make this happen.
Building on that, you just mentioned a few minutes ago, as you know, you mentioned as Xi Jinping moves to build this techno-security state, and this is really the core framework for your book. And the main argument is, it's not just a bunch of discrete little reforms or upgradings; it's a wholesale shift in gear in the basic motivation and architecture of the Chinese state's purpose, or one of its main drivers. So I wonder if I could ask you to just linger for a minute on this conception of a techno-security state, right, which has two components on technology and security. What is this? What is a techno-security state? And I think critically, what is this a fundamental transition away from what I think many would think the key focus of the Chinese state is on, which is growth? And that has been what seems to be the main focus for so long. What is different about this techno-security state, and where, at some point in your answer, where does economic development fold into this, if at all?
Okay. So let me take the next 4 hours to answer that question itself. So first of all, I mean, sort of, in my books of the techno-security state, wow, it's like, I mean, so China's front and center. It's like I actually sort of like spend a chapter to explain that the techno-security state is not just about China. It's a broader concept about understanding the nature of the state, and sort of the state, whether it's a top-down or a bottom-up state, or it's sort of a market-orientated or a state-led sort of state, and it's like and how from that it's like the state is engaged sort of like in economic development, technological innovation, and sort of like ensuring national security, both broadly national security, domestic sort of security, but also the role of the military. And many sort of, not many, but it's like a number of other states have gone down that path, this balancing between security and sort of development and technology innovation. The US is a techno-security state, but it's a very different one. So that's sort of like to frame what I mean by the techno-security state. It's a broader term than just what's going on in China. But in the case of Xi Jinping and China, it's like, I mean, the starting point, I think, of how he thinks about the techno-security state is, as you talk about, and he sort of emphasizes this, especially at the 20th Party Congress, is the relationship between economic development and national security. And he talks about this very, very often, sort of in a lot of the leadership speeches, in terms of the key documents that I sort of like poured through, where he talks about that development and security are different sides of the same sort of like phenomenon. It's like on two sides of the coin, or he often talks about this, like, I mean, they're the two wings of the bird of China. And the question is sort of like what is the balance? Under his predecessors, I mean, from Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, it was always about economic development, and economic development as the top priorities, and national security was secondary. But Xi Jinping, when he comes to power, he still says, well, development's still sort of the most important, but security has to come up more, etc. And so there's this sort of like adjustment. It's incremental. Sort of initially when he comes to power, it's like he doesn't emphasize that security is more important than development. But I think that, apologies, my dog is like having a bad dream and sort of making sort of whining noises. But in sort of throughout his sort of like his tenures in power, security becomes more and more important as the security environment becomes more threatening. So that by the second term, like at the 19th Party Congress, the relationship is much more sort of like it's at an equal levels, development and security even more. But as we see with the 20th Party Congress, it's security now that has become even more important. And so it's that sort of like that adjustment in that relationship. So as security becomes more important, how do you go about sort of addressing sort of the security needs of the state, etc., both from an economic, a technological, a political, and a military perspective? And so for Xi Jinping, sort of like when he comes to power, it's like he sort of like especially sort of at the third plenum, sort of all of the 18th Party Congress, sort of like in the autumn of 2013, he begins to provide sort of like his idea of what I think sort of the techno-security state is, etc. It's like, yes, it's like, well, there's a lot of this is focused on economic development, but on the security portions of the plan, he talks about the need for military-civil fusion, the need for revamping the People's Liberation Army, etc., the importance of innovation. And it's like, and from all of this, like the important role of the state. And the state is the party state, etc. So the party state means it's like there is a need for more of the sort of state-led development, sort of like a lot of sort of like allowing sort of like market forces to drive a lot of this is becomes sort of like a lot more sort of like sort of nuanced and pushback from Xi Jinping. So it's like so the broad outline comes very shortly afterwards, but it takes a while to implement a lot of this, because it's like overall, these are very, very significant adjustments to the nature of sort of the developmental state that had sort of been put in place for the previous few decades.
I wonder if I can now ask about a few of the planks of the techno-security state, or China's version of it. One, I think that we have to begin with is just how the party under Xi Jinping, or Xi Jinping's himself, conceptualizes national security, which is likely different from how many of us, if we were to put on paper how we would one sentence definition it. China's version under Xi Jinping has become much more expansive in terms of the inputs of it and concerns. I wonder if you can talk a bit about how Xi Jinping's vision of national security evolved definitionally from previous administrations, and B, if you could give us a bit of a linear description of when did movements begin in the national security space under Xi Jinping, and what were some of the main sort of early reforms that were occurring under Xi Jinping in the national security space?
Mm. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, when Xi Jinping sort of comes to power, it's like he moves quickly to sort of like to move away from sort of like the established wisdom of what national security is, sort of like under his predecessors, which was this sort of like this sort of neo-realist approach about sort of like about balance of power, sort of like about sort of the material power, military power, sort of economic power, sort of diplomatic power, sort of like sort of a very, very traditional sort of like sort of Hans Morgenthau approach. And so for him, who hasn't sort of spent much time sort of at the center of power, because he spent much of his time in the provinces, he comes and it's like and he begins sort of talk about what he calls this holistic national security concept, where it's like and he talks about sort of like that it's political security, it's people's security. It's sort of like it's this sort of much more sort of like of an ideological, constructivist, political approach, and a lot of that sort of like and also it's like the earlier conception of national security, sort of before Xi Jinping comes, is that it's very much sort of like compartmentalized. That you have the external security, looking at sort of like what are the international challenges to China, etc., and the domestic dimensions of security, of sort of like domestic stability, sort of like internal security, and previously that was sort of very much sort of like separated, sort of like partly sort of for conceptual reasons, but also for bureaucratic reasons. You don't want a all-encompassing sort of security system that deals with both external and domestic. And Xi Jinping sort of says like this like so it's about political security at the core, because it's about ensuring the survival, the stability of the Communist Party. That's the central part. And then he talks about, well, then there's a people's security. Yes, we have to also take care of the population. And he says like, and because of this, we have to very much sort of like integrate national security. It has to be not just about sort of like the external and the domestic, but they have to be very much integrated together. And because of this, a key part of his concept, his implementation of this notion of the holistic security concept is that it's like we need new organs. We need a very drastic redesign of the national security system. And so, sort of like about a year and a half after he comes to power, he creates this new entity, the Central National Security Commission, which is a fairly shadowy entity, but it sits at the very, very center of power itself. And it brings in sort of all these different entities, the military, sort of the public security apparatus, the intelligence apparatus, and various other entities, etc. And from there, it's so what we have is external and domestic. And then he then he talks about, well, it's what national security did then. It's with the political and the ideological and the traditional military is also important. But then it's he defines it. Well, it's about cultural security, it's about economic security, it's about financial security, about all these things. And in the 2015 national security law, they actually have has a definition where there's 11 concepts. It's pretty much everything that you can put in there itself. And so it's so all of this then is becomes national security, and and it evolves over time itself. So it's as he builds up this national security state, and the techno-security state also comes along. It's it's an ever-changing entity. As I said, it's at the beginning when Xi Jinping comes to power, it's a fairly China's security environment. It's fairly benign. There's not that many different threats, but as I said, he sees it much more concerning. But then you have all these other threats that comes. You have the great power competition with the U.S. in the second term. The worries about on the economic side, about the technology side, etc. And so this concept of national security becomes even more broader. It becomes more expansive. And one particular point is that when Xi Jinping thinks about national security, in his first term, it's economic security is mentioned, but it's not very, very important, because it's China remains very much integrated in the international economy. It's technology. There's no major threats to it. But today, economic security has become much, much more important, whether it's supply chains or whether it's critical parts of the economy. And so what we see in 2022 compared to 2012 is that the notion of national security has evolved very significantly in line with what he and his colleagues see as the major threats to China.
I wonder if I can ask a follow-on question of, you've just described nicely the expansive or the expanding definition of security, which is now encompassing this widening set of issues and concepts, culture, ideology, in addition to traditional issues like border security. At a conference on the comprehensive or overall national security concept in April of this year in Beijing, in one of the readouts, there was a quote from a professor at Peking University, Wang Yizhou, and I just wanted to read it for a second because I wanted to ask you a question about some of the shortcomings of this very expansive definition of national security. So he writes, in his oral remarks, which were summarized in a conference readout, he says, quote, "As the list of national security concerns grows, this may lead to a situation where the country is overwhelmed with limited time and resources. Ministries are overwhelmed and national decisions are misguided, which may have significant negative consequences for the development of the state, the nation, and society." What I think he's politely saying is, if you describe almost everything as a security issue, you have trouble prioritizing and also matching scarce resources to issues of highest level priority. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me when you look at the discourse on national security domestically in China, if you look at local government notices, everyone is infected with this woolly notion of national security. And I do see some of the critique that Wang Yizhou is subtly making here as being a real significant shortcoming. What is your assessment of that? Is that just the natural price of moving from a more disconnected and maybe insufficiently expansive definition to, a more holistic approach? Or do you see this as potentially being a shortcoming of Xi Jinping's everything is a security issue view of the world?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it's like, and those comments. I mean, it's as you mentioned, it's like when everything becomes national security, then it's like, yes, then how do we deal with all of this? It's like we have scarce resources. Well, that means we need to have even more resources to plow into this, and resources not just in terms of sort of money, but we need to sort of like securitize even more parts of the system. And so, I mean, this is a fundamental dilemma for Xi Jinping, is that it's like when you look at things through the prism of national security, everything becomes, is it a threat or is it not a threat? It's less about sort of development and those issues, and sort of like and one of the key concerns is that the security bureaucracies, whether it's the military or it's the law enforcement, or it's sort of the political discipline or the anti-corruption, sort of all those entities, they get sort of even more influence and power. They crowd out sort of like the non-security apparatus, the economic bureaucracies, and then everything becomes very sort of zero-sum and very risk adverse, and so you have the snowball effect, and of course, because a lot of this is Xi Jinping's sort of personnel, sort of grip on this. It's like he very much sort of like is the security czar. Everyone has to play to him, and there's like and it's very difficult to push and oppose this from other leaders, etc. So it becomes sort of like the security echo chamber that takes place, and so I mean, that has very serious long-term effects. It's like it makes China a lot more rigid, sort of a lot more sort of like suspicious and inward-looking. It makes sort of like development a lot more difficult when security is sort of like is so central. I mean, it's like a great case study is Hong Kong, right? Where it's like I mean, sort of before Hong Kong sort of like becomes its own version of the national security state with the enactment of the national security law, etc. Hong Kong was pretty open and freewheeling, and now it's like, I mean, it's like sort of like there's very little dissent. So it's like there's no free press. It's like it's sort of like sort of a lot of dynamism has been taken out of sort of like of what we see in Hong Kong society within the Hong Kong economy. This plays even more so in China, and so this vibrant sort of like developmental state that has sort of grown so rapidly, sort of like so freewheeling in China, sort of like from sort of the 80s to the 2010s. It's become, as we see now, it's like and it's not just because of COVID, although COVID is very, very, very key. It's like, I mean, a lot of this vibrancy, a lot of the freewheeling nature of Chinese economic development has been drained, I think. And so it's like I mean, Xi Jinping's only been there for 10 years, and he looks like he's going to be there a lot longer. And it's like, I mean, and there's like this security prism that he looks through I can see becomes even more restrictive. And so this has sort of like has very, very significant negative ramifications for China's long-term prospects and development.
Your end sentence there is a great segue to another tack I wanted to make, which is now thinking of the implications of this techno-security state for China and how you assess the progress China's making on this front. How would you imagine right now the conversation in Beijing is on how far they have progressed in addressing some of these national technological, military, national security challenges that were assessed 10 years ago and have been evolving over the last decade? What do you think on the whiteboard that Xi Jinping has of areas we've made progress on and I'm satisfied, gaps and then roadblocks? What do you think that whiteboard looks like in terms of the real salient major points that he's A, satisfied with, or B, feels like the techno-security state has a lot of a long way that it has to go?
Yeah, I think it's so for him, sort of like his strategic vision, and he provided this at the 19th Party Congress. It's like he says, well, the first sort of decade that I'm in charge, like right up until the beginning of the 2020s, it's laying the foundations, laying sort of the key pillars of the techno-security state. So that's like the national security strategy, military civil fusion, sort of like military strengthening, sort of as part of their military modernization issues, sort of developing sort of the framework for the innovation-driven development strategy, etc. And those are sort of their foundations. And so it's like he says, but it's like, the real implementation takes place in the 2020s, etc. And so it's like, and that's why sort of like 2020, 2021, especially last year, was a very, very important sort of like sort of part of his sort of strategic vision and his long-term strategic plan, because last year is when he enacts sort of like the 14th five-year plan. That is sort of like the key part is the first half of the 2020s, where a lot of these implementation issues are in there. But also, another very, very important part is like this is when they implement sort of like the 2021 to 2035 medium and long-term science and technology development plan and auxiliary plans that look at that. So that is sort of the next sort of 15 years of China's development to 2035. That's sort of mentioned in the 14th five-year plan. It's mentioned in the 20th Party Congress, although they don't sort of review that. That's all now sort of kept sort of like secret, etc. But for Xi Jinping, it's like it's these next 5 to 15 years, the medium to the long term, that is critical. And from there, he says, well, the foundations have been laid. So we're making sort of like good progress in a number of areas, especially some of these sort of mega project areas, semiconductors, AI, some of these sort of emerging tech areas. Yes, we have major problems, sort of roadblocks, sort of like issues. Human talent is one. He talks about sort of like the national innovation system is not well reformed, etc. We have to tackle that. So it's like it's manpower, it's the organizational structure that is a problem, and it's this sort of like so excessive dependence on foreign sources of technology and know-how that they're trying to reduce, especially when it comes to supply chain, etc. And so it's like, so the scorecard, I think, when you put all this together, is that sort of like China's done sort of probably an A- to B+ in setting the foundations, but it's like in terms of the strategic plans, in terms of where the resources are coming from, that's been excellent work. But now it's how do you implement all of this itself? And so, and a key part, especially in terms of like the technological development part, is that Xi Jinping sort of like talks about sort of like what we have to make a major adjustment. A lot of the China's sort of technological development, both on the civilian side as well as on the military side, has been very much sort of a catch-up, absorbing from abroad. But it's like, but if we're really going to become sort of like sort of like the country that challenges for global leadership, we need to pivot to a much more original innovation model. It's about breakthrough and disruptive, and we really sort of like we haven't done very well on that itself. So a key part now is to how do you put the foundations of sort of an advanced disruptive breakthrough technological model of development, then that gets sort of like spread out to the military and other parts of the system.
On that point, one of the things that the U.S. is grappling with as it looks to build its own semiconductor industry here in the United States is it's not just about R&D, but it's about building out an ecosystem which can sustain innovation, and that is a cascade of secondary, tertiary, challenges around human capital development, about your educational system, about housing, about all of the things that you need to build in. And so I wonder, as you talk about the sort of next phase for Xi Jinping as he's looking about areas where we need to advance, it's one thing to develop. Also, it's second point is it's one thing to develop a technology, but really it's about the diffusion of the technology effectively within your domestic economy. So I wonder, how do you assess the likelihood that even if Xi Jinping sees the problem, that China's political system will facilitate that next step that China wants to make? It seems like the political economy is still riddled with significant institutional, ideological, political challenges that I don't see. As you mentioned, Xi Jinping is going to be in power for the next 732 years. He's unlikely to wake up and have a very different view of the role of the state. So do you think they'll be able to make this next step and address some of the challenges which you just outlined?
That's another very good question. So there's different levels, sort of from the technology development level. So like Xi Jinping has actually, he and the planners around him, they talk a lot about the national innovation system. He talks about it sort of in his speeches, etc. And there's a lot of sort of focus on this ecosystem and all the different elements. Yes, it's not just about technology. It's about, as you mentioned, it's about education. It's about the governance system, and it's about sort of like competition and all of those. And actually, China's done a pretty good job in sort of like and even Xi Jinping is like he talks a good talk about understanding how the national innovation system needs to be reformed and revamped, and we've seen sort of like quite a few measures. So from a technical sort of innovation perspective, they've actually done the Xi regime has done a good job on reforming, revamping, and overcoming this. But the key problem that you talk about is how does the national innovation system survive and work in the broader political economy itself. And so what we're seeing is that under Xi Jinping, sort of both the techno-security state, but the broader sort of political economy of technology development is very much the statist entity. That is like it's driven by the state. It's very much sort of a top-down. I mean, sort of like he's come up with these notions of a new national team, sort of like of how you mobilize that, etc. But it's like but fundamentally, it's about state intervention and state-driven sort of development approaches, whether it's through state-owned enterprises, or it's through sort of a combination of public-private partnerships. But at the end of the day, it's the state that defines and leads that, etc. Compare that to the U.S., where it's sort of like it's the U.S. system and the U.S. techno-security state. I've defined as much more of an anti-statist. It's much more of a bottom-up, of a market-driven approach, where it's like the private sector. They need the state but they don't want the state to take an overweening sort of like interventionist perspective, etc. And in many ways, it's like, a good sort of comparison for how these two models have played out is in terms of the COVID policies, right? So for China, sort of like their zero COVID is very much sort of the statist approach to development, where the state intervenes, and it's like and in many ways it's like at the beginning sort of like of the process, the state they take all the risk, sort of like they can put all the resources they can mobilize, and they can do a pretty good job. But the problem then is that the state has to continue to do that. On the US side, it's like there's much more of a balance of sort of there's the state, but the private sector plays an important role. And eventually the state says, well, we have to pull back, and it's the market driven approach. And so what we're seeing then is like, whether it's the US or other countries, it's like, the state's retreat is a critical part to long-term success and sustainability. On the Chinese side, they found out that it's like if you put all your eggs sort of in the state-led basket, you have to continue doing it, and unless you have an off-ramp, it's like sort of like a lot of the weaknesses, a lot of the limitations begins to overcome the successes and advantages of the state-led system. I mean, it's like the COVID is sort of like is here and now. We are seeing that, but it's like in terms of China's technology-led development, that's sort of like, in many ways to me, that's a long-run model of what we're seeing on the COVID side. That it's like especially sort of a lot of the technology development, especially in emerging sectors where there's a lot of risk, having the state play an important interventions role at the beginning is often very good, because it allows them to overcome market failures. Companies don't want to invest in all this risk, and the state can do that. But then, sort of like the state captures and continues to intervene, and then that becomes more and more sort of like detrimental to long-term sort of technological and economic development.
I wonder if I can use our final remaining minutes to wrench the steering wheel in a radically different direction, Tai. But I suppose this is about the military applications of some of the capabilities China has been developing, or another way of saying it is China's perceptions of what it can do with a lot of the capabilities it has developed. You wrote a piece in Foreign Policy, I think in October, where you analyzed what you thought the implications of the ongoing war in Ukraine were for how the People's Liberation Army was thinking about Taiwan contingencies. And if I can quote one of your own sentences back to you, you said, from a strictly military perspective, the Ukraine crisis has very likely pushed the timeline for a Chinese attack against Taiwan backwards, not forwards. I wonder if you can unpack that a bit of how do you think the PLA is processing events? There's a debate, part of this is we don't entirely know how they're processing it. And of course, the war is still ongoing. So, it's like, coming to a conclusion about a football match that's in progress. But why did you come to that conclusion, and what were the kind of drivers, or what are the real salient things which you think are causing the PLA to think that they might need more time?
That's a wonderful question. And as you rightly point out, that everything's contingent now, because we don't know what the end result, especially from the Ukraine war, is. To me, it's fundamentally, it's like both the PLA as well as sort of like the defense industry, so the Chinese defense industry's conceptualization of future war is a useful starting point, right? And so it's like in the PLA, it's like there's sort of like this cohort of young Turks who are sort of like in key think tanks like the Academy of Military Sciences, who are sort of the main who are very, very influential, and Xi Jinping sort of talks and relies on them, and their conceptualization of war is sort of like is what is sort of defined in sort of the PLA's official doctrine of local informationalized war, which is that technology plays a critical role, and it's high tech and it's emerging technologies, whether it's AI, sort of like or sort of autonomous systems or information centric warfare. That's sort of like the key conceptualization of war, and Xi Jinping sort of like buys into that and sort of is building a lot of the PLA structure. But it's like, but the Ukraine war is fundamentally different. I would actually say it's like if you look at sort of like the Ukraine war, it's actually the inverse of what this PLA thinks about what war is actually. Sort of the Ukraine war is very much of a large scale industrial era war of attrition, where it's like you use a lot of your traditional capabilities, whether it's like ground capabilities or air capability, and there's only sort of very small pockets of high tech or informationalized warfare. Sort of like for the PLA, it's like, I mean, they don't see that. They see it's like it's 21st century warfare with very small pockets of 20th century industrial sort of like sort of age warfare, etc. And so one key question is, what is correct? It's like in a Taiwan scenario, is this sort of like this 21st century conceptualization of high-tech informationalized, or what the PLA increasingly says, intelligentized warfare of autonomous systems, etc. And it's like, and so, or is it this sort of like slow-moving, attritional warfare that is like, it seems to be that sort of the Taiwanese and the US thinks like, well, if we can do that, if we can sort of replicate what the Ukraine has done and build the defenses like that, then we can sort of like significantly prevent the PLA from winning. And so I think it's like for PLA planners, for PLA strategists, and also for their defense technology people, it's like this is major food for thought. Have they? It's like if it's one or the other, it's like they need to hedge their bets, and it's like and so when they haven't built sort of like or they've moved away from a lot of these traditional 20th century warfare, it's like of mobilization, of having enough capabilities to fight a long scale war, not in just in terms of weeks, but in terms of months. If you don't have those capabilities, then you're in serious trouble. And in many ways, it's like if the PLA loses against Taiwan, it's not just about losing a war.
Right.
To me, it's like it's fundamentally they will sort of the downfall of the Communist Party is also at risk. So what we see in the Ukraine war is significantly raised sort of risks and sort of to an unacceptable level for them to put all their eggs in one basket about what they've been doing. So they need to do things differently.
Yeah. We just self-plug for a moment, although this is your book event. We just put out a short paper last week looking at some of the economic financial consequences of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Much of this informed by how the U.S. and advanced economies responded after Russia's invasion. And you don't have to expect that the United States would do a Russia to China, but you do see that it's very hard to conceptualize an attack on Taiwan that doesn't result in extraordinary economic financial costs for China, even if it quote unquote successfully invades Taiwan. So one does hope that there's enough accurate data sensors in Zhongnanhai and in the PLA, which means that they're seeing real world events and hopefully reconsidering, or having some doubts about how successfully they could undertake some of these. With And on that note, I stuck the landing because it is 4:29 exactly. So by the time I finish the next few sentences, it'll be 4:30 on the dot. And so I want to let everyone go exactly on time. But Tai, thank you for a rich discussion. I can't emphasize enough that we've just skipped a stone across the surface of this very deep lake of insight that is the book. Innovate to Dominate: The Rise of the Chinese Techno-Security State. Really a necessary book for folks trying to make their way through this technological competition between the United States and China. So Tai, thank you very much for your time and look forward to your next book.
Okay, thanks very much, Jude. I look forward to that in another 10 years' time.
Okay, bye. Thank you very much.